Welcome to this week's View on Africa. My name is Omar Mahmoud, and I'm a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies based in Addis Ababa. And this week we're going to talk about South Sudanese refugee perceptions of the peace and conflict going on in South Sudan. And this builds off of a piece of research ISS did towards the end of last year, in which we interviewed South Sudanese refugees on these specific topics, on their perceptions of peace and their perceptions of conflict in South Sudan. We focused on refugees in the Gambela region of Ethiopia and also the Ajmani district of Uganda in order to get a diverse sample set in terms of origins, experiences, and those types of dynamics. So, I think the first aspect we need to look at is what are South Sudanese refugees thinking on some of these aspects. Across the refugees we interviewed, there was 4 clear themes of convergence that came out and 2 of divergence. So in terms of areas where refugees converged in some of their perceptions and some of their thinkings, the first area would be a high degree of frustration. Now, I think this makes sense. Many refugees were frustrated with their status as a refugee, frustrated with the way the IGAD revitalization process was ongoing, and a perceived focus on power sharing rather than addressing root causes. Frustration also with the South Sudanese political class. And in terms of this aspect, this leadership frustration in particular, was a key theme that many refugees across different communities came back to again and again. Though I would have to say, in the case of those we interviewed in Gambela, there was a very high association for the SPLM-IO under Riek Machar, and a very strong association there that didn't come across as strongly with any other political leader, with any other set of refugees. Now, second, and also connected to this idea, respondents expressed concern about a lack of voice in their peace processes, particularly in the IGAD revitalization process, but in other dynamics as well. And I think this is important, especially when you look at the IGAD process, because there was, at various phases of that process, refugee representatives who attended a few of the sessions and contributed in some sort of manner. But most of the respondents we talked to had no idea about that dynamic, and those who had even dismissed it given a lack of transparency around the selection of those representatives, or even feedback or follow-up after those sessions. But so this idea of the lack of voice in the process also ties into the frustration, and especially the leadership frustration, meaning that the respondents we interviewed felt very little stake or ownership in terms of this peace process. Thirdly, surveyed communities all agreed that they suffer from a lack of information. And it's not just a lack of information, but a lack of trustworthy information, especially given a reliance on social media and some of the inherent biases that come out through that. In the absence of official communication, rumor tends to fill the vacuum, and a lot of the respondents we talked to were having difficulty separating rumor from fact or opinion from fact. And some restrictions on political activities in some of the communities and camps feed into this as well, as camp leaders noted that they couldn't hold sessions about the peace process, about some of the developments without prior approval. Now, fourthly, in terms of areas where there was broad convergence, respondents were very critical on certain aspects of the revitalization process. Many viewed IGAD as an organization as potentially biased in itself, and I think that depended on one's personal perspective, but they would point to certain instances or certain examples of that. Or they would point to the region very much focusing on their own interest rather than looking at the greater good, and so seeing countries not necessarily being involved in the negotiations regionally with South Sudan's, the interests of peace in South Sudan in mind. Interestingly, though, I would have to say that there was strong support for Sudan's role as a mediator in this process. We all know that the last phase of the revitalization process before getting to the revitalized Arxis agreement occurred in Khartoum, and many respondents were very supportive of that. Some did talk about Sudan's interest in terms of getting oil flowing back, but others were very much supportive of Sudan's role as a peacemaker, which I think is a stark contrast and dynamic to the history of adversarial relations there, and really shows the desperation of many of these refugees for some sort of peace dynamic. Another commonly held complaint when looking about the revitalized Arxis deal was about the number of vice presidents involved, and I think this is a symbol or a dynamic of the greater power-sharing aspects that's focused on, and the criticism of that. Many refugees wondered why there needed to be so many vice presidents, and I think the quote from one in northern Uganda in particular was very telling in this regard, when he was discussing this dynamic and really asked rhetorically about the number of vice presidents, whose power are they really sharing anyways? So now, of course, those were some broad areas of convergence across the study. There was also a number of areas of divergence, given that the respondents had very different experiences and very different views on a number of areas. The two biggest ones I would point out relate to two very unresolved questions in South Sudan today itself as well, and which shows the interconnectedness of South Sudanese refugee views and dynamics back in the country. Now, those two are the number of states, or the federal question in South Sudan, and also the issue of national dialogue. I'll start with the number of states. I think this was one of the most contentious aspects, as respondents very much had different views on this, which largely broke down along regional or ethnic lines. Not exclusively so, but by that I mean those respondents we interviewed originally from the Equatorial region were very much pushing for a three-region or federal solution, as some of the political leaders from that area are pushing. Those from the Dinka were more supportive of the 32-state dynamic, which the government has introduced. Not exclusively so, but a much stronger support. And those in Gambela, who are predominantly Nuer and more associated with the IO opposition, had a broad range of views across the board on the number of states, but very much had agreement that they did not support the 32-state dynamic. So you see this broad differences, and I think that's a reflection of those continued or the unresolved nature of this in South Sudan as well. National dialogue was the other very controversial element, also breaking down along regional lines. Most of the Dinka respondents we interviewed were supportive of it. Others from Gambela, for example, very much saw it as a tool of the government, and it even claimed to not participate or chase away representatives who would come to talk to them about it. And those upset with the process really centered around two main factors. One being that they saw it as a tool of the government, but two, seeing that and to what degree that's holding. So I think it's an important thing to monitor going forward. So I think I'll close the VOA there. That summarizes a few of the key points from our recent refugee study, which is urging for greater inclusivity of the refugee population into future peace dynamics in South Sudan. And that study is available on our website, and so you can read it and find a bit more of the findings there as well. So thank you for tuning in.